The house was too big for one woman's grief. Amanda moved through rooms that remembered laughter, high ceilings, polished floors, photographs that seemed to watch her. But each corner returned only an echo. She had learned to live inside that echo, to fit tenderness and fury into the same small hands. She spoke to the child who slept in a nursery painted in soft blues, though his eyelids would never open to sunlight the way other children's did. "You are mine," she told the baby, when the house held no other heat. "I will teach you every shape of love." Outside the glass, the city kept its indifferent hum. Inside, Amanda measured life in minutes, feedings, the creak of the swing, the soft scrape of a spoon against a bowl. People called her brave. They called her generous. They spoke of Amanda Okoro, the woman who had everything and somehow still reached. Affection arrived as headlines and bouquets, but it never touched the place where she had been hollowed out. She had been hollowed before the child arrived. Her sister's hands did that, gentle at first, then colder than winter wind. Amaka had smiled and said the right things at the right times. She had brought casseroles, offered to sit while Amanda slept, filled the silence with practical suggestions. No one recognized the ruthless patience beneath that care. On the night Amanda went into labor, a week earlier than expected, Amaka was at her side with the practiced calm of someone who had rehearsed sympathy. She soothed, adjusted blankets, promised to fetch water. Later, when the nurses pushed beds and the warm, bright chaos of a delivery room shifted toward exhaustion and relief, Amaka's eyes flicked to the nursery window, as if memorizing a scene. The swap did not require fireworks. It required an understanding of small rhythms, the way a tired midwife carried a swaddled infant down a corridor, the moments a doctor glanced away. Amaka did not snatch. She slid. She had a man with quiet hands and a pocket that made other people's choices simple. Dr. Admi had his debts. He had his daughter's tuition overdue and a ledger of men he could not pay. A white envelope, folded and neat. A look exchanged at a moment when the room thinned and vigilance slipped into tiredness. People made easy choices when their choices were already purchased. Amanda came home from the hospital with a child whose palms were as small as she had dreamed. The child was hers by every measure she had been given. The wail in the night, the way a hand curled around her finger and refused to let go. He slept at the small hollow of her collarbone and took comfort from the shape of her breath. She named him Peter after a grandfather who had taught her to whistle with 2 fingers. Then, as tenderness turned into the slow testing of days, Amanda felt a restlessness she couldn't name. There were mornings when the house felt stranger, where she would watch Peter sleeping and wonder at the shape of his nose, at the set of his jaw. He blinked at sounds she made, but did not flinch at brightness. Her nurse told her gently that some children were born with conditions they could not foresee. It made sense, and Amanda made sense of it, because making sense was what she did. Only in the small, private hours, when the world narrowed to the infant's breath and her own, did the blankness return. She would imagine another child somewhere, a boy with a startlingly clever mouth and a hunger she could feel in the marrow. She fed and bathed and sang and learned to feel the world through hands that could not see. Jacob watched her from the threshold. He was a man who fixed things for a living. Engines, bent metal, problems that would yield if someone had time and patience. He had been in Amanda's life at a time when both needed something steady. They had loved in a way that was full of awkward pauses and tender forgiveness. The city had taught him to keep his head down. Poverty had taught him to demand less of fate. He wanted to be everything Amanda needed, but he was a man weighed by bills, by the constant ache of insufficiency. His fingers were always stained with oil. He had a daughter who slept at another house, a wife named Mariam who kept a temper lightened by small mercies. He had said things he could never fully take back. He told himself he would find a place in Amanda's life, not by the insistence of grand gestures, but by the steadiness of hands on a steering wheel, by the late-night repairs he did in a workshop that smelled of gasoline and diesel and hope. He would not be the man who promised rescue. He would be the man who refused to leave. Amid the small domestic routines, Amaka's plan lay in patient waiting. She had been born with a hunger that never slept. Amanda's success had always been a bright thing that rubbed against Amaka's skin. Where Amanda was public, Amaka felt shadowed. She had charted Amanda's life like a map of opportunities to hurt, to claim, to tilt. 5 years would be a slow knife. The first 2 years passed like a study in devotion. Amanda worked harder than most would have believed possible. She opened a community wing at the hospital, funded screenings, gave speeches about responsibility. The press liked the image. The billionaire who had nothing but love to spend. They did not know how the nights softened into a low, constant ache, how her laughter had a crack in it that widened in private. Peter flourished in her care in every way but one. He learned songs by touch. He recognized people by voice and the cadence of touch. He loved rhythm, like a holy thing. He loved the smell of rain on soil. He loved the world the way a person who lives with an absence learns to treasure textures. Far away, in rooms with cracked ceilings and paint that had been peeling since a drought, another boy grew thin and brilliant. They called him Philip in the orphanage, though the letters on his file were often smudged. He scavenged words like food, learning them with a hunger that made books his only sanctuary. He drew complicated machines with charcoal stolen from a workshop. The old matron of St. Mary's called him a clever child, too clever for his own good. He had a way of listening that made people think he was waiting for the precise moment to surprise them. Philip, as he would sign his name in blocky capitals, kept a small contraption he had made from bent wires and a discarded radio tucked under his pillow. He spent nights studying the way knobs fit together, dreaming of engines and the sound a well-timed bolt made. He learned early that other children were fed first, and that brilliance sometimes had to be bartered for a plate. Amid these years, Amaka's son Chisholm grew into his small cruelties. He was a handsome boy made ugly by a training in dominance. He had been taught that tenderness was a weakness. Under his mother's encouragement, his temper became a tool. When he came to Amanda's house, his smile was a blade she had not yet recognized. He learned to find small vulnerabilities and exploit them. He discovered the peculiar satisfaction in pushing and watching someone bend, but not break. He delighted in the hush that followed a child's cry and the way the powerful avoided scandal. Chisholm's ease with coercion made him useful to his mother. He had associates who slipped under the city's skin like snakes. They were subtle in their sabotage. A missed delivery here, a minor accident there. Jacob found his motorbike's tire slashed 3 times in 1 month. He fixed it and thought little of it, because life demanded action, not theory. The men did more than slashed tires. They made sure that when Jacob fixed cars, he took home evidence of bruises he could explain away. They left a message in the form of a jab at the ribs that would remind him he lived in a city where the powerful could still reach those beneath them. Dr. Admi did not sleep easily after he swapped those infants. He dreamed of ledgers and receipts, the small soft hands that had touched the envelopes in a dim corridor. His daughter sat at a school bench while he paced the hospital corridors and wondered which version of himself he had become. He spent nights rationalizing, a daughter's tuition versus a moral compass broken for an hour. He had a face that saw guilt and the face that could not afford to be haunted. He swallowed both. Amanda could not name the hollowness at first. She was busy writing checks to fund blindness care clinics, answering reporters' questions about motherhood and philanthropy. She had created a life in which the limits of wealth were a soft shield against life's harsher teeth. She had hired the best specialists, the most expensive tutors, the therapists who would help Peter develop a vocabulary of touch. She read aloud to him, her voice a lighthouse in a world of darkness. Friends called and said she was extraordinary. She smiled and agreed, because there was no language for the emptiness that gripped her when she watched other mothers smiling at their sighted children. Some nights Amanda sat in Peter's nursery and hummed until her voice fatigued. She tried to imagine a face she had not seen, to wonder about laughter that came with a hunger Philip had. She had a photograph of a newborn on her phone, one she had never shown to anyone. She had saved messages from nurses who had changed shifts too soon, notes that became talismans. She kept them like small, fragile keys. Jacob's life then was a mirror of pressure. He worked longer shifts. He argued with Mariam less, and paid her bills with the shitty pride of a man who did what he could to keep roofs over heads. Helen, their daughter, grew sullen with the knowledge that the man she loved moved through the world in two halves, home and workshop. Sometimes Helen watched Jacob's ache like a learned thing, witness to the way men folded their shoulders under responsibility. She had seen him held down by men in the street once, had watched wounds bloom on his arms, and listened to the soft truths he would not say. She learned to hide fear behind small adult words. The household in which Jacob lived was a quiet theater of compromise and shame. Mariam drank tea while Jacob left for another night, and came back with pockets lighter, but a conscience clearer. She had forgiven indiscretions she could not number. She had washed wounds that were not hers. She loved Jacob in the hesitant way a woman loves someone who is needed by the world as much as by her. When she discovered that a child in a mansion might be the source of the man's turmoil, she had a fierceness that was not loud, but steady. She wanted fairness for Helen, for herself, and for the man she loved, and she wanted him safe. Night after night, an undercurrent ran under these lives. Amarka watched from a place that could buy silence. She attended events that made her sister's name glitter in the press. She smiled at every camera and catalogued every smile as another thing she would take. Her wealth was not simply comfort, it was the instrument she used to shape the world into something smaller and more controllable. Where Amanda built institutions, Amarka built traps. A series of small wounds widened into open threats. A clinic Amanda had funded opened, but one wing saw plumbing sabotage that cost thousands to fix, an absentee bill that made headlines as mismanagement. Amanda's board members quarreled. They whispered about vulnerability and poor oversight. A last-minute inspection turned up forged documents that created endless meetings and second-guessing of Amanda's leadership. Her advertisements, once glossy and unreviewed, became fodder for bloggers who liked the scent of scandal. Each wisecrack against Amanda made room for whispers. Jacob's workshop became a place where men offered more than payment for repairs. They offered information, a van seen at the orphanage late at night, an unfamiliar man slipping past a security guard. He kept the information because it was what he had, small, accidental observations. He filed them like loose screws in a box, not knowing they would later form a machine. In the orphanage, Philip built his refuge in attention. A teacher named Sister Ruth saw him and felt the sharp line of responsibility. He could recite the components of an engine by the time he was 7. He could mimic accents and tell jokes with a precision that betrayed a mind used to observation as survival. He was malnourished in different ways, food scarce, affection scarcer. He learned to conceal hunger beneath jokes and to ask for books instead of bread. At Amanda's house, Peter learned to recognize the house by the angle of sunlight on the rug. Amanda developed a battered ritual. She would take him to press his palm against the panes of the balcony and tell him stories of birds. She would let him feel the rhythm of music on a speaker and map landscapes by the sounds of steps in the house. Her patience was an ocean. It could swallow many things. She also felt a secret, a pang that had the shape of the child she would one day know as Philip. When Jacob found a small device under the seat of his motorcycle, his first thought was practical. Someone had left trash. It was not trash. It was a tracker. A tiny metal thing, almost invisible unless someone looked with intent. He pocketed it and told himself he would throw it away. Instead, he took it home and laid it on the cluttered kitchen table. Mariam found it and stared for a long time. "These mean you're watched," she said without anger, and the fear in her voice undid his defenses. "It could be anything," he replied. But the words were listless. The men who'd been following him had pockets of the city's dark appetite. He'd been warned off asking questions, and on 2 occasions a hand had pressed too hard across his ribs to remind him of what the city expected from a man beneath the big houses. When Jacob pressed his thumb into the tracker like a child pressing a bruise, he felt foolish. But he kept it. He kept it like a coin he'd found on a street, evidence of how close the powerful were willing to come. Chisholm planted fear like seeds. He picked fights with the boys and Amanda's household staff, called the blind child's crib the wrong name, laughed when the child's caretaker stumbled from exhaustion. He took his friends to the orphanage and sneered at the children who were not his. When he grew bolder, he began to spread rumors about Amanda's mental state, about a careless staffer who might know too much. He curated a chorus of doubt that would make the strong falter. In the middle of all this, Amanda met with lawyers and did what she always did with challenges. She coordinated them into something actionable. She demanded an audit when the sink in her clinic failed. She called a board meeting and spoke in tones that turned away whispers. She sent men in suits to the hospital to ask about nursery records. They told her she was paranoid. She listened to their humane explanations and went home unsettled. She slept badly and dreamed of 2 cribs side by side. She woke to blurs of memory. A hand at the nursery window, an exchange in the corridor, a white envelope pressing against a palm. She kept the images like the edge of a map and traced them in the privacy of her mind. She asked questions at precise times, to nurses who had moved on, to a doctor who had a new practice in the city. Each answer had a grain of something unsaid in it. One day, 2 nurses who had once worked at St. Mary's stopped by the foundation, ostensibly to accept a donation. They stayed long enough to be in the orbit of Amanda's staff. Their eyes flicked a little too long at the nursery photos. Later that week, a housekeeper came across a folder misfiled in the records room, a series of photographs with a timestamp that did not belong. They were dim, fuzzy, a still from a small wall-mounted camera. Someone had taken them and forgotten to change the label. Amanda's hands trembled when she looked at the frame that was unintelligible until the image was enlarged. A shadowed corridor, a hand reaching into a bassinet, a silhouette stepping away. It was small. It could be anything. But Amanda's mouth tasted of iron when she thought of it. The picture was the ghost of the crime she could not name. It gave her the desperate, sacred permission to stop not knowing. She asked her lawyers to see every CCTV running that night. The hospital pushed back with bureaucracy, retention policies, data privacy, broken drives. The city politely suggested that some files were overwritten after 2 weeks. Amanda's money made polite requests into pressure. She sent men to coax servers, technicians, a lawyer who drank little coffee and made lists. The hospital denied wrongdoing. Someone at the hospital called it a misunderstanding. The man who held keys to a nursery archive looked at Amanda's photographic print the way a man looks at a ghost. He said nothing for a long time, and then he told her there was a nurse who had been fired that week for negligence and who had left the country. He was apologetic and then deferential. He tried to make her understand how complicated things could be. Amanda could not make herself be reasonable. She wanted to know what had happened to the child she did not see and to the child she did. Her rage began to have a shape. It was not a public rage at first. It was private and terrible, a coiled thing that wanted to be acknowledged. She stopped arranging lavish dinners. She stopped smiling at the right times. She began to collect names. Jacob found himself at the center of a small storm he could not control. The tracker on his bike sent dots on a map to men who recognized the street names. He was followed home once, circled by a car that kept its lights low. He found a note in his toolbox that said, neatly, "Stop digging." Helen read it and held it like a confession. They began to be careful. Jacob stopped taking the long route home. He avoided late-night shifts. But danger widened like a ring. One afternoon, he came home with a shirt torn at the sleeve and a bruise along his cheek. He excused it as a fall. Mariam watched him while he cooked and smiled like safety, and did not know how to ask questions that would make things worse. Jacob said nothing of the men who had pressed hands into his collar and said that there were places he should not go. Philip grew into his mind in the orphanage. He would disappear to a corner with a scrap of metal and a pencil and draw diagrams for engines as if the future depended on him. Sister Ruth worried aloud about his thinness. He read anything he could find, manuals, old magazines with photographs of automobiles, a battered encyclopedia left to rot in a storage room. He taught the other boys how to open a rusty radio with a spoon. He collected the names of people who had left the orphanage visiting hours and never returned. When Amanda finally demanded access to the hospital's archived footage, the director gave reluctant permission. They found fragments, frames saved to a backup server as insurance against suits and lawsuits. One clip showed a shadow moving quickly, a gloved hand settling a bundle into a stroller. A second frame showed the same hand moving away. The timestamp was wrong by minutes. It was not enough to convict. It was enough to jar the world. Amanda held the frames like a lit match. She showed them to the people who still listened. She played them for Sister Ruth, who watched and cried a little, and for Jacob, who came to her house with grease still under his nails. He stood in the doorway and knew the image was something he had been circling his whole life, a cheap, brutal power that made the poor invisible and the rich unaccountable. "I could go to the police," Jacob said, and the exhaustion in his voice dampened the certainty of the words. People like him who went to the police came home with promises. People like them came home with mouthfuls of cold night. Amanda refused to be calm. She did not ask for justice politely. She demanded it. She paid for a private forensic firm to magnify the frames, to run their slow, expensive algorithms. She hired a small team to scour hospital records, to interview staff, to track bank deposits that liked the color of the envelopes Amaka had been seen carrying. It was transparent violence. With enough money, truth could be mined like ore. She used the tools at her disposal. When the first arrests were whispered about, they were for low-level staff. The city liked to show that it was responding. It arrested men who had pockets rather than the mastermind who had pockets and a motive. Amanda's lawyer pushed the issue, and more names were mentioned in the gossip columns. She did not sleep. The frame of the hand stayed with her, pressing warmth where a wound might be. She imagined the boy who had been taken, hungry, bright, sucking knowledge out of the world like thirst. Meanwhile, under the city lights, Chisholm grew restless with impatience. His mother had become a target of inquiry, subtle at first and increasing in desperation. He could not abide the idea that his mother's careful plan might be picked at by cameras and lawyers. He would do what he had been taught, strike where the hurt would matter. One night, Jacob left the workshop with an envelope of cash he had refused to owe anyone. He walked with Helen at his side for a bit, listening to her ask about stars and why some people had to be so cruel. He told her stories about engines to distract her. She listened like someone who needed the world explained. He kissed Mariam when he slipped through the door with a bruise already forming bright on his cheek. He smelled like oil and rain. He told himself, not to be a hero. Someone else had different plans. The men who worked for Chisholm did not announce themselves. They slipped into alleys like smoke. They watched Jacob as he fixed the dent in a neighbor's car and left a cigarette burning in the ashtray of their own van. They learned his routines with the patience of professionals. They watched him text a brief message. "I'm fine, coming home." And they decided to make a new truth of it. When they moved, they were quick and merciless. Jacob felt a hand at his shoulder, a glove at his mouth, the sudden cold of air as he was forced to the ground. He tried to shout, but a foot pressed into his back and the world tilted. One of the men muttered, "Not a sound," and Jacob's breath doubled like a bell. He thought of Mariam's tea waiting on the table, of Helen's hair braided in tight lines. He thought of the child at Amanda's house, whose name he could not speak without a rush of fury. He thought of Philip in a room with cracked paint, a small boy with too many questions. He thought that this would be resolved. People always thought injustice could be untangled by witnesses and cameras. The men threw him into the dark of a van, and the city swallowed the sound. Amanda's phone vibrated hours later. It was a simple text style. "I'm fine. Nothing more." She read it as if the letters might rearrange into a message. The number had Jacob's name in her contacts. She wanted to believe it. She could not. She felt the old hollow open like a wound, and the match she had been carrying flare into a bonfire. She knew then that the thing she had been building, audits, lawyers, CCTV frames, would have to meet another kind of world. It was not only about records now, it was about the men in the night who moved with the permission of money and silence. Amanda moved with a speed that was all the more frightening for its precise calm. She did not know whether power alone would be enough, that there could be a cost to any choice she made, but she was certain of this. She would not stand by and let the man who had kept two lives together be broken into pieces by men whose hands had never ached. She answered her phone and found herself speaking to a voice she had hoped not to hear. Chisholm's intermediary, that clipped tone of someone comfortable doing harm. They offered terms that smelled of blackmail and rust. Release would come in trade, they said. They wanted a public withdrawal of the accusation. They wanted the hospital records handed over. They wanted money placed in accounts no one could trace. They wanted most of all to see Amanda kneel. She could kneel in a way. She could dissolve the pursuit by using her money to make the problem go away quietly, to choose an institutional fix that did not embarrass the family that had made a dangerous choice. That was power, the slow hand of courts, the heavy weights of lawyers, the ability to buy privacy and make inconvenient evidence evaporate beneath a flood of legal fees. Or she could choose blood, a private reckoning, a risk borne on the edges of law, a retribution that would make a sound and leave stains. Blood was not only violence, it was a willingness to step outside the law's slow teeth and meet force for force. It might mean confronting a marker where the law could not reach, or it might mean showing up to bargain for Jacob at a dark place and taking what business had taught her to avoid. Personal sacrifice and risk to reputation. Amanda sat on the couch with Peter asleep against her chest, and the photograph of that shadowy hand warmed in her palm. She thought of two futures. One where institutions, her institutions, would take up the work and clean a wound at great cost, but by rules. Another where she would take a hammer and hit and be hit and become someone else entirely. Her fingers tightened around the photograph until the paper was warm. Somewhere in another house, Amarka's face was a mask of political serenity. She had designed outcomes and contingency plans. She had never planned for the stubbornness of a woman who had learned how to lose and keep loving. She had not accounted for the way Amanda's rage could be used like oxygen. She told herself that the city would blink first. She reminded herself of the ledger in a locked box, of the men who would cut and run if the heat came. But when news of Jacob's disappearance brushed like a hand across the papers, a small flicker of fear dispelled the controlled confidence. Chisholm smiled, as if he had not done anything wrong. In the light of that night, with Jacob gone and the city holding its breath, Amanda had to choose. The options offered their own dangers. Using power would secure proper legal channels, hidden payments, the drafting of public statements that would stifle scandal. It would be clean on the surface, but corrosive in the depths. It would buy the world at the price of a truth that might never be spoken aloud. Choosing blood would be a surrender to an instinct that promised immediacy. Rescue for Jacob on terms she set, not those the city offered. It would be raw. It would be personal. It would carry the risk of permanent damage to everything she had built. She could not decide in a single night. She paced the rooms until dawn dragged its fingers through the curtains. Friends called with advice that, in the end, asked for nothing but their own comfort. Her lawyers advised caution. The police offered forms and vague sympathy. The intermediaries sent clocks and numbers and threats. Peter slept on, ignorant of the calculus being performed over his life and the lives tied to it. He woke sometimes to a whisper of the wind and reached out like a child learning a new word for the world. When the men in the van tightened the ties around Jacob's wrists, he felt humiliation and fear in equal measure. He was terrified not by the beatings, but by the thought that someone could take him in the service of a choice he had never been allowed to make. He had always tried to be the one who fixed, the man who turned broken things toward usefulness. He had never asked to be broken. The engine of the van hummed in the dark. A single lamp painted stripes across the canvas of his hands. He remembered Amarka's face, smile like a window that could be opened to let cold in, and he remembered Amanda's quiet, severe determination. He wanted to say he was sorry for being insufficient, but the word crumbled in his throat. Outside, a city moved in joyous ignorance. Inside, decisions were being formed. On paper, in whispers, by men with money, and by a woman who had to choose whether power or blood would be the instrument that brought her man home. If you want to see where she goes next, like and subscribe. Amanda made 2 calls before the sun finished splitting the horizon. One was to Mariam, the other was to a man who had been her fiercest rival and also her most useful ally, a lawyer named Obina, who ran a firm where words had weight. She arranged a meeting at a diner that refused to notice the weight of billionaires or mechanics. She arrived with Peter strapped in a carrier and a photograph in her pocket. Obina listened without surprise. He had built a career on the intersection of money and damage control. His fingers tapped the table like a watch assessing time. "You can use power," he said, "to make things happen. Courts, media management, the right judge, those are ways to move mountains. But there are costs you don't want to pay. There are things money cannot mend." "What if money can buy silence?" Amanda asked. He pointed to a photograph of the CCTV frame she'd brought. "The truth likes to leak, even through money. People fear prison and exposure. They also fear the cost of losing everything. You can make someone have to choose." He tapped the table again, slower. "But the men who staged this, if your enemies are willing to abduct a man and make a trade, there may be people beyond the reach of typical levers. They will not be bought down by a settlement." Amanda thought of Philip in the orphanage, and Peter on her chest, and Jacob on the floor of a van. She felt a pressure under her breastbone like a fist. She had spent her life building trust in systems, hospitals, courts, boards. Now a system had been used against her and the man she loved. Later that day, under a sky the color of cheap metal, a man, not unlike the ones who had abducted Jacob, called Obina. He had a message to offer, a list of conditions to see the mechanic alive. Obina listened politely, then hung up. He had a method that involved the law's slow teeth. He put together a plan that was legal, visible, and patient. It preserved a public image and promised to limit collateral damage. It was the map of power. At midnight, Amanda sat alone in her kitchen and opened a photograph of Philip's face, found months earlier hiding in an orphanage file. She traced the shape of his mouth with a trembling finger. She thought of a man who had the look of someone who had learned to be self-contained, and she felt an immediate, irrational longing to stride into alleys and insist on blood for every bruise. She thought of the consequences. She had built a life on being counted upon. She had built hospitals and charities. If she chose revenge in the form of blood, if she slipped into the city's shadows and hired men to take back what had been taken, it would tarnish her in ways courts might never repair. Her businesses would suffer, the boards would distance themselves, the institutions she had built might slow under scrutiny. But if she chose power, she might secure Jacob's release through negotiation and exposures, through law and money. And in doing so, she might sacrifice the private satisfaction of watching her enemies confess in a way that would feed her anger. She might let justice be patient rather than visceral. She might become, to the city, the same woman everyone admired, composed, dignified, above the petty need for blood. She had been raised thinking survival was a chain of choices, each one carrying a cost. She had always chosen carefully. She was finally asked to choose between two forms of violence: the structured violence of institutions and the unstructured violence of personal retribution. Both would stain her hands. The van carrying Jacob rumbled over speed bumps that felt like the beating of heart against chest. He tried to orient himself by the dull thrumming under his boots. He counted backwards from 12 and then stood at the number he had been taught in safety classes at the orphanage. Breathe. Do not imagine the worst. The worst is only a possibility until it finishes the day. He did. He did not let panic be the captain of him. He breathed, slow and shallow at first, then deeper, like someone learning a rhythm that might keep him alive. The van rolled through a city that was asleep in sections and indifferent in others. The men who held him moved like professionals, curt nods, glances at watches, hands that never lingered where they could be seen. They called him by name sometimes, reading him aloud as if to remind him of his place in a ledger. One of them, younger than the rest and with a scar at the jaw, liked to speak. "Your woman is rich," he said once when the van paused and the engine went quiet. "She will do something for your life." Jacob thought of Mariam's soup waiting cold on the table, of Helen combing her hair with a cupped hand, of the cheap curtain that fluttered in their one window. He thought of Peter, the blind boy who had learned to map a house by the thickness of footsteps. He thought of the thin, clever child at St. Mary's, who had always kept his hunger soft as a joke. He held on to them as if they were threads through a net he could not see. They drove him to a place that smelled of damp concrete and rust, a warehouse that had been given new life by shadow. Men arrived and left like tides. Jacob was pushed into a chair and tied at the wrists with rope that burned. They fed him water and asked him questions he could not answer. Where Amanda kept certain papers, which files in which hospital office would embarrass her, whether he had ever spoken with the press. He gave them nothing because he had nothing to give them that would make his wrists come free. At nights, he learned the value of nights, they turned a small lamp on him and laughed to each other in languages he only half understood. They made audio recordings of his breath to send like a market price to Amanda. Later, a phone with a video call sat on a crate between them, and the screen lit with a face he knew. Chisholm. Not merely the boy who had grown menacing at tea parties, but now a man whose impatience had been taught into cruelty. Chisholm was lubricated by a pleasure that came from watching fear. "You should have kept your distance," he said to Jacob, the words soft as a threat. "But you didn't. So now we play." They recorded, flicked snippets to Amanda's phone that showed Jacob's hands, Jacob's bruised cheek, Jacob trying to laugh, and they demanded terms. They wanted a public walkback, access to certain hospital servers, cash moved into offshore accounts. They wanted to make it hurt in the way that would be televised, a confession, an apology, a surrender of the pursuit she had begun. The city, which had stood so solid and clean in its corridors for Amanda, had shifting allegiances in places like the warehouse. Men with no names answered other men with less patience and even less remorse. Jacob watched them bargain with the dignity of those who have no conscience to be ashamed of. He thought about leaving clues, about marking the van while they were careless, about appealing to some innate decency that had never served him. The options dwindled. Tucked into a far corner of the same city, Amanda amassed an army of smaller ones, private investigators, an ethics firm that could follow money like a bloodhound, a communications team that would not shrink from scandal if scandal meant leverage. She met with police captains who moved between hope and caution. She sat across from a detective with a long face and a ledger of his own disappointments, and made him see what he might gain by stepping harder. "Bring me evidence," the detective said finally. "Bring me a recorded call. Bring me their men. We can move, but only with probable cause." Amanda handed him a collage of possible causes and told him to choose. She had the money for wiretaps and the resources to pay witnesses to tell the truth without fear of losing food. Power had leaned her way her whole adult life. There were judges who had taken her to charity galas, business partners who were loyal enough to owe debts of gratitude. They meant something. They could make men like Chisholm sweat. But money did not reach into that van or lull the men who sat in it. Money did not unmake the taste of fear. Power was a long blade, clinical and accurate. Blood was immediate, messy and final. The choice sat heavily on her like a robe soaked in cold rain. She called Obinna again. The lawyer's eyes did not soften. He had made oaths in his profession to advise, not to preach. "You can run legal pressure and make the state do the work," he said, "but understand what you're sending him into. The state is patient. Sometimes patience means they will not move until incidents pile. You can force activity with threats. You can buy allegiance with money. Or you can do what I have seen a client do once, take matters into their own hands. That will make headlines that will not be kind. It will make comfortable people angry. It may get a man out faster." Amanda's mind mapped the options, and then refused the neatness of both. She sat in her car with Peter strapped in the back, and thought of the image that had started everything. The hand in the nursery, and how small a thing it had appeared at first. She imagined waiting for the legal mill, and found she could not afford the hours. She imagined a man whose breath might run out in a place with no windows, and could feel the compass in her chest tilt toward immediacy. She called Mariam to demand patience from the wife she loved as a small, steady country. Mariam, steadfast and practical, spoke of lawyers and police. She offered simply a hope that was almost unbearable in its simplicity. "Whatever you choose, come back to us with him." Amanda thought of Helen, and of the thinness of Amanda's own father when he had been sick, and how dollar bills had been useless in transfusing back the days that mattered. She thought of the boys, Peter, whose world was built in textures, and Philip, who had learned to become his own library. She felt a mother's hunger, a thing that could make the neatest plans disintegrate under the heat of wanting. She made a decision at the small hour before dawn, when the sky had the pallor of paper. She told Obinna, through a tight line of restraint, that she would make a choice for blood. "You're sure?" Obinna asked, the words heavy with the import of what would follow. She did not answer with explanations. She answered with a photograph she had kept folded in a wallet. A baby with a clever mouth and a hunger like a question. "I am sure." He did not approve, but did not refuse. He set his face into the blandness a lawyer learns when they must watch clients do what bridges ethics. The law would take its course later. For now, he arranged a thin legal counsel for afters, papers to be filed, a path to turn whatever would happen into a narrative that might preserve her assets, because even blood, when shed by the powerful, required preparation. Amanda reached out to people with no public names. a retired army captain who taught security to private firms, a woman who had been a fixer in the old days, who now ran a small consultancy that combined threats and rescue. She did not advertise their services. She slid a check across a table and told them a truth. Get him back. Bring him home. I will accept the consequences. These people worked in places where law and illegality rubbed shoulders like indifferent neighbors. They asked no philosophical questions. They asked for details, times, phone numbers, last known coordinates, and they promised a plan that was practical and silent. Jacob was in a room of damp light when the first sound came. A click, and distant voices, and then a slap of shoes against gravel. He thought the men would come for a payment. He thought the city would barter him like a coin. Instead, the door opened, and a different set of men slipped in, hoods over faces, hands braced and quick. They spoke in short bursts, and then moved like ghosts, snapping ropes. Someone with a cracked tenor voice said, "Move." And Jacob, whose injuries were humble, moved. They hustled him through a service corridor and into a van that did not belong to his abductors. The city passed in a blur. He could not tell whether he was being rescued or exchanged. He was careful not to ask, fearing the question itself might stop the engine. His worst fears were never a single image. They were a slow unspooling in which the body remained intact, but the self was changed. Amanda sat in the passenger seat of a car that smelled of oil and coffee. She had insisted on being there. Obina argued that she risked everything. She argued that she would rather her name be ruined than watch a man that mattered to her be paraded from one cell to another. She thought of the way the choices of the wealthy often carved paths that bled into other lives, and she felt the hunger to not let that be the last story. They stopped in an industrial strip where the lights were half working and where the map said little about compassion and more about commerce that tried to pass for indifferent. Men in hoodies stood like statues, and a figure moved from shadow to light. For a moment there was a negotiation, voices low, a paper passed that might have been money or might have been a false promise. Amanda watched Chisholm's men as predators watch prey, with the precise mix of contempt and calculation. A hand touched Jacob's shoulder, a release, and Amanda pushed through and grabbed him like a fisherman hauling what he loved out of the water. He was alive. The world for a second narrowed to the smell of him. Sweat, diesel, the sweet iron of blood that had not been spent. The men around them noticed the movement, and then the van doors slammed, and someone started to shout. It happened fast afterward. A collision of intentions. Chisholm's men moved to block, and Amanda's team moved to wedge open a path. Voices climbed into metal. A knife flicked free and was flung aside. Jacob, who had been a man making small repairs his whole life, used a hand that had once held a wrench to steady himself and to shove a body away from a path. In fury, the hooded men lost their polished pace. In fury, Amanda forgot all the rules she had spent a life keeping. She did not kill anyone. She would later tremble at how close the edge had been. She kicked a hand away from a throat, and she pulled Jacob into a car, and they fled. The city swallowed them in yawning traffic. She watched in the rear view as men circled the lot and then dispersed with the practiced speed of those who had missed an opportunity to steal back dignity. They went to a safe house where a medic patched Jacob's bruises, and a woman with gray hair and precise hands wrapped his wrists gently. He slept like someone who had been given a reprieve and did not know whether to trust it. Amanda sat awake, hands folded like a prayer she could not speak, and watched him breathe. Her chest was a museum of choices she would now have to explain. The aftermath arrived quickly, and with the inevitability of storms. News spread. Someone had photographed the rescue from a side street, and within hours the story was a splinter of itself cropping up in amateur footage. The headline writers loved a different truth. Billionaire rescues mechanic read one. Another said, Vigilante justice in the city rich woman does what police could not. Social feeds erupted in a way Amanda had always funded as a politician of generosity. Some applauded, some vilified, some pored over the ethics as if they were sport. She had wanted Jacob back. She had not wanted the world to make him a spectacle. The police arrived the next morning with warrants and with a look that was somewhere between gratitude and accusation. The detective who had promised action stared at Amanda, and then at Obinna, and then at the medic bandaging Jacob's wrist. "You broke laws to get him," he said without malice, "but you also put him into more danger." Obinna had prepared for this meeting. He had stacks of paperwork that argued for mitigating circumstances, for coercion as motive for what came next. He argued for leniency, for the need to see the whole picture. The detective agreed to delay charges until after a hearing, but the papers would be filed. For all Amanda's power, the law had a way of taking its own view. She had chosen blood. It had consequences. What came next was the slow, public unraveling of a hidden life. Chisholm's men were identified, and one by one arrested in the following weeks. A sting followed, not by Amanda's hand, but by the state, as investigators used the rescue's evidence to trace calling patterns, to link money and movement. Amaka, who had until then enjoyed the comfort of money and influence, was brought back into custody. The discovery of bank deposits and photographs and phone messages, some sloppy, some deliberate, laid her culpability bare. Dr. Admi confessed in court, shame and fear cleaving his features. He spoke of pressure and of a ledger that had been more menacing than conscience. The orphanage's files, dusted like relics, produced another miracle and another wound. Philip's DNA confirmed parentage. When Amanda walked into the room at St. Mary's and saw the thin boy with the clever mouth, the world shifted on an axis she had not expected. He studied her the way one studies an object that has been missing long enough to have become a legend. She reached out, and he took her hand like someone meeting a ghost who had finally learned to speak. The reunion was not cinematic in the way tabloids wanted. It was shambolic and delicate. Philip, now tall enough to be called a child no longer, cried once and then stopped. He was intelligent in ways Amanda had not expected, ruthless in the economy of attention, quick to analyze gestures and motivations. He did not throw himself at her. Rather, he watched her with a clinical curiosity that made Amanda's heart both ache and bloom. Peter watched from a quiet corner of the mansion that night, his hands mapping the fabric of a new blanket. He wanted the boy whose face he had glimpsed to fit alongside the shape of his world. Amanda, careful with both sons, took them like two people who had been given different maps and must learn a single city. The legal battles that followed were loud and public. The papers printed both the rescue and the rescue's consequences, like two faces of the same coin. Amanda was investigated for abduction and for endangering witnesses. She was privately accused of staging a spectacle. The state argued Chisholm's men had been provoked, and that vigilante acts created a dangerous precedent. Defense attorneys lined up with arguments that wound between law and morality. Amid the legal rout, there was human truth that the cameras did not always capture. Philip needed shoes that fit, but more than shoes, he needed language to name the lost years. He asked small, sharp questions about things most adults took for granted. Why some people did not come to breakfast, why certain words meant danger. Amanda taught him names of simple things first, how to read a room by sound and how to ask for help without shame. She apologized, and then apologized again in ways that could not fix the past, but could build a scaffold into a future. Jacob returned to his workshop because it was what grounded him. He smelled of diesel and shampoo and the lack of sleep. He was quieter at first, and his hands trembled at odd times when bolts slipped. He went to a counselor at the city's clinic because Amanda insisted on it, and because Mariam wanted him whole. He carried in his eyes the look of someone who had been taken for something he had never agreed to give. Mariam, who had feared both being left and being dragged into spectacles, took Jacob back with a hand that was both warm and weary. Helen listened to the stories he told and folded them into her own life, as if they were ornaments she did not dare display too proudly. Chisholm faced a trial that stripped him of the gloss his mother had tried to wrap around him. In court, he looked smaller than the headlines had made him, and his arrogance cracked when witnesses, some from the orphanage, some from the hospital, spoke of his cruelty. Sister Ruth's testimony was quiet and precise. She described food lines and nights with doors left ajar, the boredom of neglect, the small thefts that became survival. She did not glower. She spoke in the meticulous cadence of someone recounting facts. The jury heard enough. Amarka presented herself in court like someone fighting the weather, calm on the surface, but eroded beneath the skin. She had allies who spoke of her philanthropic work. She had men who whispered that poverty understood the world differently. But the evidence, ledgers, photographs, recorded messages, Dr. Adme's confession, was a rope around her position. The law, which can be patient, had finally assembled its own kind of violence. Amanda sat in the front row through much of the proceedings. Sometimes she watched Philip in his seat, like someone trying to read a text and finding a new grammar. She spoke when asked, but she kept much of herself behind a face that the public had been trained to dissect. She was questioned about motives and methods. She took responsibility for getting Jacob back. She refused to frame it as anything other than a mother's action and a lover's decision. The press delighted in the contradictions. They painted images of Amanda as both savior and villainous. They dissected the rescue's ethics in editorial rooms that liked to feel both righteous and entertained. The boards of her foundations summoned her. Some stood by her. Others distanced themselves. Donations to charities she had built trembled on promises in the air. Power was exacting in its calculus. It rewarded and it punished. There was a hearing later when the state considered charges against Amanda. Her defense argued necessity, that facing an imminent threat justified a raid of the sort she had executed. The prosecution called witnesses to show that taking the law into one's hands undermined the social compact. Obinna, who had been by her side like a dry stone wall, marshaled paper after paper. Amanda's choice for blood had produced consequences she had not underrated. She had known there would be legal storms. In the end, the court arrived at a compromise that felt more like a truce than a resolution. She was fined and given community service and a period of probation. She was also absolved of the most serious charges on grounds of reasonable belief and the irregular actions of those who had held Jacob. The judge's words trembled between compassion and the need to issue a deterrent. "We cannot condone vigilantism," he said, "but we must also serve justice to those who cause harm." The line pleased no one completely. Amarka and Chisholm received sentences that unmistakably separated them from comfortable life. They would pay with time and with the slow disintegration of social position. Dr. Adme was sentenced to rehabilitation and community labor and to a public apology that he delivered with a face like a peeled onion. Philip's DNA had been a key chord in the case. It was proof that made private wounds public and accountable. The state could not wipe away his years at St. Mary's, but it could force institutions to answer to neglect. There were reforms promised for orphanage oversight, new audits, funding oversight, and regular inspections. Sister Ruth worked with reform committees and found, to her own surprise, that she could sit in rooms with officials and make them listen. It was small repair, bureaucratic and slow, but it mattered. Within this shifting scene, the emotional aftermath was a messy, stubborn thing. Philip struggled to find words for himself in a family that had flattened him with wealth and rescued him with love. He and Peter met like two people sharing a room after a long separation. Peter, who learned the world through sound and texture, found Philip to be something like a map that had been lost and then returned with new handwriting. They argued about small things, how to set a table, whether silence was a comfort or an affront. Amanda listened and learned how to be a mother to two boys whose histories did not overlap neatly. Jacob returned to the workshop and completed a job that paid less than his pride could accept, but more than his days had held a month earlier. He and Amanda had difficult conversations about choices and consequences. He was grateful, and sometimes he could not find a way to manage that gratitude without feelings of humiliation. They navigated a new intimacy where both had been broken in ways that honesty might someday stitch back together. Mariam watched from a distance that was not absence, but self-preservation. She had her own trauma catalogued in nights of worry. She had learned to demand respect for domestic life in a way that had never required public spectacles. She took the children to school sometimes and sat in the back of assemblies and listened to lessons about civics and the cost of choices. Amanda's businesses did not collapse, but they contracted. Donors who were fickle changed their minds, contracts were delayed, some board members resigned with pressed statements about stability. At the same time, other supporters doubled down, moved by the woman who had taken a risk and paid publicly for it. The net of public opinion resembled weather more than judgment. Some days bright, some days stormy. What she had chosen had given and taken. Jacob's life had been restored in the immediate sense, but Amanda's social capital had been nicked. Her heart had been soothed, but it felt raw in new places. In private, she counted the weight of decisions like coins. She had chosen blood to save a life. She had chosen blood at a cost. She had confronted the city's rot with a hammer and found the rot sometimes required a scalpel. Months later, in a courtroom, when Amaka's sentence was finalized and the judge pronounced judgment that would see her removed from social position and stripped in ways that would be painful, Amanda watched the woman who had taken so much from her and felt not triumph, but a strange exhaustion. Amaka listened to the sentence with a composure that had always unnerved Amanda. She did not meet her sister's gaze in the end. She left the room like someone closing a book she could not reread. The city made room for reforms at St. Mary's. New funding arrived, and Philip, who had been appointed a small scholarship that allowed him to study mechanical engineering at a technical college, swallowed the opportunity like a thing that was simultaneously terrifying and good. He learned to build with clean materials and clean promises. He found, slowly and not without fits of anger, that engines could be poems and that mechanics could be poets. Peter thrived in a different way. Amanda taught him to use a cane with dignity and how to weave descriptions of the world like tapestries in speech. He learned to identify birds by their songs and to trace the house by steps and textures and the scent of soap. He loved Philip for his brightness and his stubbornness. He loved Jacob for his quiet hands that could fix anything. In the quiet that followed, Amanda often found herself alone at night with a cup of tea gone cold. She would look at the photograph of the nursery and at the paper that had once been a small thing in a staff folder and now had been a key to a season of wrath. She had chosen blood, and she had bought back a life with something that would not be erased by apologies or court papers. Sometimes she imagined the alternative, the path she might have chosen if power had been her tool. In that imagining, Jacob would have been returned by a slow law, by a carefully orchestrated raid, by subpoenas and cameras, and a judge's gavel. The rescue might have been cleaner then, less scarred by headlines, and less bloody with its moral stains. People would have praised her restraint. She would have kept her life more intact. But she had heard Jacob gasp in the van each time the door closed, and had felt that the cost of waiting might have been too high. She sat with Jacob one evening on the porch, as rain tapped at the roof like a nervous audience. They spoke not of the headlines, but of small things. How Helen had learned to braid her hair, how Mariam laughed at a joke that used to be only Jacob's. Jacob held her hand, and did not speak the things he might have, like that he would have stood alone if she had not come. "You chose," he said finally, when the talk had been pared down to the simple language of people who had seen things and needed to say them. You chose the thing you wanted me to have back. Amanda's fingers tightened around his. I don't expect you to understand it in the perfect way, she said. I expect only that you'll be here. He nodded. I am here. The moral ledger for Amanda did not balance neatly. She faced sanctions, threaded the needle of public opinion, and in the rooms of magnates and fundraisers, she found herself reading faces for trust, the way mechanics read engines for a misaligned bolt. She had done what she had to do, or what she thought she had to do. There were people who called her brave, and people who called her reckless. Both had reasons. Philip's path forward was an elegy to resilience. In the months after the trial, he took classes, first hesitantly, and then with a hunger that sometimes frightened Amanda. He fixed a car for Jacob in the shop once, and both of them laughed when it started. The sound of success, a small music that mended more than metal. He visited Peter and taught him to identify the pattern on a tile by touch. They learned to be brothers in a household that had once only contained echoes. Amid legal fallout and media storms, Amanda did the one thing she had not been able to do before. She sat in the nursery and told her sons the truth in a way their ages allowed. She explained theft and its consequences and offered apologies that were not excuses. She explained that sometimes people choose wrong because they are desperate, and sometimes they choose wrong because they are cruel. She explained she would do anything for their safety, but that the doing carried a price. When a camera would sometimes come by, and cameras always came back, the children were given the dignity of small statements or none at all. Amanda would say what was required, and then shepherd them away to the privacy they needed. The world wanted stories of murder and revenge. She wanted stories of repair and a sober kind of love that wasn't always showy. The city, as cities do, moved forward. Laws were tweaked. Orphanages found themselves under more scrutinous eyes. Dr. Admi visited clinics to speak of responsibility. Some things healed at the speed of bureaucracy. Some did not heal at all. People adapted, or they resented. For Amanda, the changes were both external and intimate. In quiet moments, she would find the photograph of the nursery hand folded like a memory, and think of Amarka's unusual generosity given to betrayal. She would imagine the sister she had had as a child, 2 girls in a small house with a single lamp between them. She would imagine what had hardened one and made the other tender. The answers were not neat, and they never would be. Once, in a subdued visitation room at a low-security facility, Amanda was permitted to see Amarka. The sister she had loved and been betrayed by sat across a table with hands folded and eyes that had the tired calculation of people who had been clasped too tightly by their own choices. The conversation was not loud. It was a scraping, honest thing. You made me very small, Amanda said when she found the words that did not flame. Amarka's mouth tightened. You were always in the sun, she replied, not softening. You took everything I could want. We both lived with what we could not fix, Amanda said. You tried to fix it by stealing. That was wrong. Amarka for a moment laughed without joy. You would take the law and not the hunger. That's not the point, Amanda said. The point is, you hurt children for your satisfaction. Silence thickened. They traded nothing like apologies. There was no catharsis in that room. There was only 2 women who had existed in parallel and had finally collided in a way that would alter both lives forever. The choice Amanda had made, blood over power, had brought Amarka to this place. It had also left both sisters with scars only time could attempt to soften. When the court finalized sentences, and the press moved on to other outrages and heroics, Amanda walked through a garden she had once planted for peace. It had come up in wild ways and domestic weeds. She looked at flowers whose names were only partially known, and thought about how lives grew around neglect and attention in equal measures. She knew she had saved a man she loved. She knew she had harmed her public self in ways she would have to heal. She knew that both sons would carry the story with them into the architecture of their futures. She had chosen blood, and it had the taste she expected. Iron and absolution mingled in complicated ways. There were nights when she thought of power, of the slow, surgical ways the law could have fixed things, and wondered whether patience would have kept a man from being bent into a van. There were nights when she dreamed of bending the neck of the city's rot and finding the root. The dreams did not reconcile into neat imagery. They were messy and human. In a way that was perhaps the truest cost, Amanda discovered that power and blood were not as binary as she had thought. One led into the other like rivers conjoining. Her act of blood produced a legal aftermath that demanded the exercise of the institutions she had sometimes wielded with a lighter hand. She had used violence to restore a life, and then used power to negotiate the legal consequences. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and then used every instrument she could to render the world less likely to do the same. Months later, at a small community meeting in a hall she had once funded, she listened as parents argued about the responsibility of the wealthy, the poor, and the state's duty. They spoke of the orphanage and the reforms that had actually been implemented. Someone asked what they should do when institutions failed them. She answered from a place that was raw and tested. "Use the law when you can," she said. "Use your resources to lift people, and if you ever have to make a choice like I made, understand that the consequences do not end with the rescue. They start then." Her words were not a manifesto. They were an admission. People took them in and left with a mix of relief and disappointment. It's the territory of anyone who makes public apologies with private scars. At home, Philip signed his name with a hand that still trembled sometimes when he wrote about hard things. He took an apprenticeship with Jacob and learned the sweet rhythms of a workshop. He was not the only child who thrived in a small, focused life. Peter learned to run in a way that made his blindness less a limitation and more a tool for perception. They argued and laughed, as siblings do, their edges rubbing to become examples of a repair that sometimes involved heavy lifting and sometimes involved gentle tending. Amanda never forgot the van, or the smell of concrete, or the sound of Jacob's breath when he woke and realized that the world had not finished with him. She would always know the precise taste of the choice she had made. If you had been in her shoes, what would you have done? Power or blood? Comment below and tell us which path you would take, and subscribe to see how the consequences unfold.